You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This episode is going to be about life-changing ideas. I did an episode recently called 4 Ideas That Changed My Life. That was episode 381. And in that episode, I talked about some of the ideas that have had a huge impact on me and the books that they came from, which I highly recommend. And the background to this is that I've been running a course for supporters of the voluntary life, for my patrons and bitbackers, on life-changing ideas. So I'm doing a live stream series where we have discussions about these great ideas and the books that they come from. And these are also released as bonus episodes, these discussions for patrons. We've done 4 live streams so far in this series on life-changing ideas, and they've been great fun, and we've had really great discussions. And so in this episode, I'm going to tell you about 4 more life-changing ideas. And I'll be telling you about the books that they come from, so you can find out more about these ideas just from this episode. But if you'd also like to take part in the live streams, then you can do so by becoming a patron of the Voluntary Life. And if you're interested in doing so, you can find links to that in the show notes for this episode or on my website, thevoluntarylife.com. So the first life-changing idea that I want to tell you about in this episode is the idea of quiet wealth. This idea comes from the books of Thomas Stanley, who wrote The Millionaire Next Door. That's his most famous book. And he was a researcher who gathered data on the behavior and lifestyle and spending habits and activities of first-generation millionaires in the United States. And his books were about the results of those surveys and those questionnaires, identifying patterns and trends and characteristics of first-generation millionaires. How is it that first-generation millionaires behave? And his book was called The Millionaire Next Door because he found that rather than being ostentatious and very flashy with their wealth, one of the defining characteristics of first-generation millionaires tended to be that they were people living next door that you wouldn't expect were millionaires in terms of their spending habits and so forth. I found this book absolutely fascinating. Reading about what it is that defines successful first-generation millionaires helped me to be more critical of this mainstream idea of success, which involves conspicuous consumption. It's the idea that whoever has the most toys wins. And Thomas Stanley's research really helped me to be more conscious about something that I'd already sort of intuitively grasped, which is that when you have money, you can either buy status symbols or you can buy your own freedom, your own financial freedom. And that's, for me, what the purpose of money is to ultimately give you more freedom. And consumption drains away your freedom. So you've got to be very careful about how much you consume. And the interesting thing is that most of the visible signs of success that you see, people driving luxury cars and so forth, usually, not always, but most of the people who really ostentatiously consume don't have a lot of financial freedom behind that. I did an episode on this, which I'll put a link to in the show notes, called Buy Status Symbols or Buy Your Freedom. And Thomas Stanley's books are really a great way to get into this idea. So if you're interested, you can check out that episode. But the place where these ideas really come from is the books of Thomas Stanley. The most famous one is The Millionaire Next Door, but I also like his book called Stop Acting Rich, which is about how to apply the lessons that he found from his surveys of first-generation millionaires in your own life. So quiet wealth is going to be the subject of the October Life-Changing Ideas live stream, and I'll provide more information about that for patrons and in the show notes. The next life-changing idea I want to tell you about is the idea of parent effectiveness. This idea comes from a book by Thomas Gordon called Parent Effectiveness Training. And this is a very famous book about practical ways to resolve conflict with children without using punishment. So it's an approach to parenting that doesn't use punishment. It's a very influential book. It's often cited as one of the best approaches to parenting. I read it many years ago before having kids, and I thought it was very good, especially because it provides an answer to this question that many people have where they can't envisage, well, what would you do if you didn't have punishment as a tool as a parent. How on earth would you interact with your kids without punishment? Well, there's lots of ways that you can do so. And parent effectiveness training provides lots of examples of constructive ways to resolve issues with your kids. It's been a long time since I've read that book, so I'm looking forward to reading it again, because that one is one that we're going to tackle in the November Life-Changing Ideas live stream. If you're interested in this idea, you can read the book for yourself, but you can also come along and take part in the live stream. I think it's one of the most important books to read if you're following a peaceful parenting approach that I've talked about many times on this podcast. And so that's the second life-changing idea that I'm sharing with you in this episode. The third life-changing idea is one that I actually haven't yet read the book for, but I'm very interested to read for myself. I've had it recommended to me by a number of patrons and supporting listeners, and that is the idea of digital minimalism. The book that seems to be the best in this field is Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism. And this is essentially the idea of taking a much more controlled and disciplined approach to your own screen time and time spent online and with your phone and so forth. The interesting thing about digital minimalism is that it's applying the same kind of ideas that we talk about in terms of minimalism with stuff to your digital life. So minimalists talk about how having too much stuff is distracting and can prevent you from focusing on what is really meaningful in your life. And you can apply the same arguments to your digital life. Your devices and social media and so forth are so distracting that they can take away from the things that are really meaningful and purposeful in your life. And I think that is a good argument. So in the same way with physical minimalism, the idea is to have some discipline about being conscious of how you use your stuff. Digital minimalism is about being more conscious about how you use your digital devices. I'm very interested in minimalism. I've done lots of podcasts about it in the past. We've also had some great discussions with patrons in the Q&A live streams that we do about this topic. So I'm interested in looking into it in more detail. I've read a couple of books on the subject already. I haven't read Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism yet, but that's the one that I'm going to be reading for this live stream. And I'm looking forward to discussing the ideas with listeners. And that live stream will be in December. I'll put more details in the show notes. And if you're a patron, you'll get lots of advance notice about it too. The fourth life-changing idea that I want to tell you about in this episode is the idea of argumentation ethics. This is a concept that was developed by a philosopher called Hans-Hermann Hoppe. So as a quick bit of background to the idea of argumentation ethics, I have always found ethics to be a really disappointing area of philosophy because the major arguments that are around about ethics, about how to think about right and wrong, have always seemed very weak to me. So there's one idea which comes from religious arguments, which is to say that you need to have a fundamental basis for right and wrong, and that needs to be something like religion. And the evidence for this is that the modern world, having become much more secular, has lost its way and doesn't have a foundation for ethics in religion. Part of that argument sounds persuasive to me in that it's true that without religion, a lot of people seem lost in terms of ethics, but I've never been convinced by the idea that the solution is just to accept what's written in a religious book as being right and wrong, or to accept religion, especially given that I'm not persuaded by any religious arguments and I am an atheist. On the other hand, when you look at the atheist arguments for ethics, I've always found those to be very weak too, because they tend to end up in some form of utilitarianism. They tend to end up in the idea that you can solve the problem of ethics by saying, well, right and wrong is determined by what's good for the greatest number of people, or the greatest good for the greatest number. And I've always found that to be an obviously weak argument with many internal contradictions. At a very simple level, just because a whole bunch of people think something's good doesn't make it good. And often these atheist utilitarian approaches to ethics end up with some kind of idea that we will be able to scientifically derive right and wrong, that science is going to make its way into ethics in some way in the future. Sam Harris is one of the big proponents of this kind of idea. And the problem with that is that, as many people have pointed out, going back to David Hume, you can't get an ought from an is. You can't determine what should be done by an empirical study of what is done. You can't say that you should do something just because of the way something is. That's a very famous idea by David Hume that I think is a very strong idea. And the other way that some people go is to become very relativistic and say that there's no fundamental basis for right and wrong, and then it's all a matter of opinion and so forth. And that never convinced me either. But the idea that really clarified the whole question of ethics for me is the idea of argumentation ethics. This is a very big philosophical topic, so I won't be able to give you a full breakdown in this summary, but the basic idea behind argumentation ethics is that it's true. You can't logically derive an ought from an is. You can't argue that you should do something from statements about how the world is, but you don't need to, because anybody who engages in rational discussion, anybody who uses discussion to make arguments, has already accepted many ethical rules just by the act of engaging in discussion. So the idea here is that people can either fight each other, where there's no discussion involved, they're simply fighting, or they can attempt to argue and convince each other. And if you attempt to engage in a discussion, a debate, an argument, you are already accepting a whole series of ethical norms just by that act of discussing. And so you don't need to derive an ought from an is, because the fact is, all of us who are engaged in discussing with each other and communicating and talking to each other, we already accept a whole series of ethical norms. And that's the fundamental basis of ethics. Because when you engage in discussion, if you then contradict these norms, you're contradicting yourself. What I find fascinating about this is that it is a secular approach to providing an ultimate foundation for ethics. I am an extreme rationalist. I am a very secular thinker. I'm not religious, but I'm also by no means relativist or utilitarian. And this is an approach to ethics that I think is the correct ultimate foundation for deciding what is right and wrong. So it's pretty deep stuff. If you're interested in argumentation ethics, there are 2 books that Hans-Hermann Hoppe wrote that explain this idea. The first one that I would recommend is called Economics and Ethics of Private Property, and that is available online for free as a PDF. And the second one is called A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, and that's available for free as well. And I think it's also available as an audiobook. Those 2 books are very big, very deep books that talk about much more than just argumentation ethics. I totally recommend them as books. They're absolutely fascinating. But if you're just interested in argumentation ethics, then there are specific chapters that talk about this idea. And I will put a link in the show notes to an article by Stephan Kinsella, where he picks out some of the places where you can read about argumentation ethics. There are other books in his reading list too that you might find interesting. I will provide links for those who are interested to get into this idea, and that's something that I'm going to discuss in detail in the January LifeChanging Ideas live stream. So if you're interested in philosophy and you're interested in ethics, then I hope you'll come and take part in that live stream, because I think it's going to be a great discussion. So there you go. Whether or not you come to the live streams, I hope you found these different ideas inspiring, and I hope you get some interesting reading to follow up on if you're interested in these ideas. That's all for this episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.